Welcome to Culture Crush with me, your host, Dan Dowman, where we get to meet some of the world's leading culture shapers, future makers, and power shakers. We'll be talking groundbreaking cultures, leadership challenges, and what you can do about them. Today on the show, I'm joined by a very dear friend of mine, Bryn Rees. Bryn, welcome to the show.
Hi, Dan. Thanks for having me. It's great to see you.
For anyone who doesn't remember a former show of mine called The Marketing 7, Bryn was one of my first ever guests. And it was quite a good little show. It was 7 minutes with leading marketers, a really short format. And it was fun, right? Like, it was nice to meet you, and we've been friends ever since.
I enjoyed the short format as well. I feel a little bit apprehensive. I've got to think for 30 minutes without a break. We'll see how we get on.
Well, that's it. Like, I've sort of abandoned my micro podcast days in favor of a longer format. But who knows? These things do tend to change over time. So who knows? Maybe we'll be back to 7 minutes before we know it. It depends if I like run out of steam, run out of creative energy for these kind of things. I want to give you an opportunity to introduce yourself a little bit and talk us through your career. But one of the things that I noticed from we've been friends for a few years now. But when I look back through your career history, you spent like a decade at Amex, you've been at Adidas, and now you've been at IKEA. Like, big brands are kind of in your blood. And I look at your career with a kind of a general sense of jealousy because, I've been looking at, I'm like, I want to go and work for brands like that. Now my career's taken me down a slightly different set of tracks, shall we say. But I think it'd be fair to say that for you, your relationship with content, marketing, brand stories is kind of a blend of art and science. So talk us through your career a little bit, but also talk about how you balance that sort of tactical lens with a sense of human storytelling and human-driven storytelling.
Yeah, and you're very right, Dan. It's been very big brand focused, but at the same time, I would say my career path has actually been pretty varied. So consistent in terms of big brands, but varied in terms of what I've been doing and what I've done. Each of the companies I've worked at has been very different in their own way, and I've had to grow and learn, and I guess get comfortable with being uncomfortable as I've gone. I like to think of myself as a lifelong learner. I'm pretty sure if you told 16-year-old me you're going to be a lifelong learner, he would have told you to go away in slightly less polite terms. But as I've matured and developed as a professional, as a person, I've realized that learning's a big part of it, and you're never really done with it, right? So I'd like to think my career has allowed me to continue being a lifelong learner. Equally, I think it's important not to pigeonhole yourself. By all means, if you want to be a specialist and follow that route and be very, very good at what you do and very specialized in what you do, if that's for you, great. For me, I actually prefer to embrace the diversity and kind of push those boundaries. I guess that's probably why, like you say, I've ended up being a bit of a mix of science and art and kind of everything in between. I've done various things. I started off in customer services, which I guess, taught me a lot about that human element, dealing with people who were often upset and stressed and needing my help. Learning my empathy skills come into play. After that, I was doing risk management, anti-money laundering. Then I moved into content management, as you mentioned. I've been doing content for a long time. Product management, experience design, which again brings that human element in. I think, if you can find a way to make products work for people, then, you're doing something right. I've done marketing enablement, content engineering, which is where we hit the sort of scientific stuff, academic stuff almost. And I'm currently doing content strategy on paper. However, my main focus at the moment is actually business process optimization. So just no, I guess a jack of all, master of none would be a fair description. But I think being a digital generalist allows me to navigate different audiences, different rooms and business domains. Equally, that's where my brain works best. So new challenges, fresh info, and then assimilating all that stuff to the current need is sort of my forte. And I guess if anyone's watching this, don't be afraid to be different. Try things, learn things, and stretch yourself.
I think the complete phrase is jack of all trades is a master of none, but often is better than a master of one. So I think you're probably onto something good there. Now, when I think about my career as a bit of a generalist, I sometimes consider myself a bit of a jack of all trades. and pretty good at a lot of things. I definitely don't know if would class myself as a master in some areas, but I'm sure, I'd like to think others might. Um, but to those people who are watching or listening to this episode, whose career perhaps has had a number of pivots like your own, right? Like, how have you managed to land some of those changes? Because your career really has moved in a really wide variety of different directions, and yet appears to be like quite a consistent career. Like, how have you adjusted, and what would be your advice for people that you're challenging, I guess, to, don't be afraid to take risks, be yourself, show up as your authentic self.
Yeah.
But that can be difficult when you're job hunting, when you're trying to figure out your next step. So what would be your advice from your experience to those people?
Good question. It can be difficult. And I think my main piece of advice would be around, don't expect things to be perfect. You're on a hide into nothing if you are trying for perfection every time. Embrace the pain. There'll be times when, you're in the darkness and thinking, what am I doing? I don't have a clue what I'm on about, and this doesn't make any sense. And invariably, the clouds do lift and you do find yourself figuring it out as you go. But yeah, I think my main advice would be not to put too much pressure on yourself to make things perfect, and just try your best, give it your all. And in doing that, your authentic self will come through, and you will navigate through the difficult times.
One of the things I've been reflecting on recently, I did a post about this just a couple of days ago, about how the earth is spinning at like 1,000 miles per hour, but we don't feel it from where we are because of our context, because of the atmosphere, because of the way gravity works. Like, we don't feel that movement, even though we are moving incredibly fast all the time. Mm-hmm. And I think that lots of people can be frustrated in the day-to-day because you're too in the moment, you're too in the context, and it can feel that change is too slow to arrive, or it can feel that things aren't falling into place quick enough. And I guess my encouragement to people is that things are changing. You just can't feel it yet. And when you look back at your life in 5 years' time, you'll be shocked about how much of your life has changed, how things have developed. And I guess day to day, there's just a challenge to make sure that you're influencing that direction in a positive way, because your life will be transformatively different in 5 years' time, even though you can't feel it right now. And what people have got to hold on to is, I can influence that direction a little bit today by grabbing the opportunities that come my way, or challenging myself to think around an issue from a slightly different perspective. But things are going to change. So yeah, how can you influence things for the better, even though it's frustrating that sometimes it can feel that change takes time? And of course it does, but things are changing.
Yeah, I love that post, by the way, Dan. It's you're spot on with it. And I think another key thing for people to kind of try and do, and I've been trying to do this personally recently, is, even though, like you say, you may not feel the change or feel the benefit in the day-to-day, if you start making a little aid memoir or note to self around what's gone well, or what has been a positive, or even things that you've sort of negatives you managed to avoid, if you do that on a day-to-day basis, then you will soon realize that you are actually making change, and good things are happening. But like you say, when you're in it, it can be very hard to take that step back and sort of see yourself from above and see what's actually going on. But if you kind of be active and proactive in making a note of it in your diary, in your digital journal, just on your desk on a bit of paper, or in your phone, you'll soon sort of think back and say, actually, this is going well.
That's a really cool little point, actually. It's almost like leaving yourself a trail of breadcrumbs so you can actually see the journey when you look back. I think that so often we forget to, if you don't keep a record or make some kind of note or some kind of way of prompting your memory, you won't know how far you've come. And so maybe just having a little discipline, leaving yourself some notes, some little breadcrumbs that when you look back, you can actually see the journey. I think that's a really, really great idea. And I would encourage anybody to give that a go. Now, we're here to talk about culture. We're here to talk about leadership challenges and what people can do about them. But before we get onto your culture crush, I wanted to ask you, in your career, in your career as a storyteller, as a human-centered creator, I guess, How has storytelling shifted in recent years? Because there's this increased pressure to be data driven and to look at the analytics and go to the numbers, which in one sense kind of puts that humanity at risk. And I'm just wondering, like, from your perspective, how has that storytelling changed over time? And how can you accommodate things like data in a human centric way?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's positive that things are changing. I might touch on this a little bit later on when we talk about the challenge as well, but I think data, it doesn't have to be hard, it doesn't have to be cold. We think of data and we think, oh God, it's massive data dumps, it's turning people into numbers, it's taking away the human aspect of it, right? And in some respects it does. We end up with segments and groupings and generation this and generation that, which may be more harmful than helpful in the long run, but it is what it is. But I do think data can be valuable, and it can often give you insights that you might not see if you are just sort of trying to navigate through without it. And of course, there are different types of data. You've got your quant and your qual. Personally, as a sort of human storyteller, I always err towards the qual and the sort of human side of things, and talking to people and figuring stuff out and getting verbatim and really getting to the crux of issues with people. I personally think that that's the best way to start, because you learn more from the people working in the processes or using the products, or struggling with particular elements of their workflow, and you can then use that as a kind of anchor to say, well, have we got the data to back this up? You kind of need to be able to use both sides of the sword. The humans generally who are making things happen are middle management, junior members of staff, people who are sort of working their way up the career ladder, or are very happy sort of being in the role they're in. But they are the ones who really, really experience it. With all due respect, those at the top of the chain may not have done that role. They might have walked straight out of some sort of Ivy League and straight into a CEO role or something similar and haven't really experienced it. So you've got to be able to sort of play both sides of the coin. In speaking to the humans involved and the majority involved in things, you get those anchors that I mentioned, and you can then tie them to data. And the data is what you take up to senior and executive leadership and say, hey, I've spoken to people, they're saying this, they're feeling this, and I'll say, well, that's all very well, that's great. And then you can say, and here's the data that backs it up. Here's the proof in the pudding, right? It's kind of making sure that you are really leaving no stone unturned and backing up your assumptions and or qualitative analysis with that quantitative stuff. And I think that goes a long way in kind of proving both sides of the coin.
That's a really interesting thought about how do you manage senior leaders who don't have experience of what you do. You're employed to do a particular thing that they can't do. Maybe they haven't experienced that role. And how do you manage those relationships? How do you use data to make your case? And I guess in your example there, it's more about being a data backed rather than data led. You go to people to find out the stories, ask them the questions, have those conversations, and then use your data to support the stories that you're finding. And then I guess if the data doesn't support the story that you found, you might need to go back and think, well, actually, we're misaligned here, or this isn't going to be a story that I can sell up the chain in my organization. But I think more often than not, you will find data that supports the stories that you're finding. Just for our audience who perhaps aren't familiar with quant and qual, why don't you just talk us through what you mean when you use those phrases?
Yes, and apologies for anyone who hasn't heard of those. I am often guilty of acronyms and shortening things. Nearly 20 years in corporations does that to you. So qual is very much quality-based, qualitative. That's, dealing with humans, doing interviews, doing surveys, side-by-side stuff with people, research essentially. And quant is quantitative, and essentially it's numbers, right? It's data. So it's two sides of the coin that I think you should always try and combine to prove your point.
Thank you, and no worries, but you are forgiven. for using
Thank you.
acronyms and shorthand turns of phrase, because as you say, that's what the corporate world does to you. But thank you for honoring our listeners with a little lexicon lesson there for a second. Now, you've already signaled kind of some of the stuff that we're going to be talking about when we come to leadership challenges and what you can do about them. But I know you've been thinking about your culture crush, person, business. It's completely up to you. But why don't you talk us through your culture crush and why you chose them?
Sure. And yeah, it was a tough one, actually. I ummed and ahed quite a lot, and sort of tried to think about why I would choose someone or a particular company, or why they would be a culture crush for me. And I netted out and ended up going back to an organization that I've always looked up to, and that's actually Lush Cosmetics. It's actually a company I almost started working at once, but it's been a really sliding doors moment. But who knows, one day I may get another chance. But I've always looked up to Lush Cosmetics. For people who don't know them, I mean, if you don't know them, you've probably smelt them. If you're walking around your local high street or airport or train station, pretty much they're everywhere now. If you smell a really delicious, sort of fruit-based, clean-based smell, that's very likely going to be Lush. They're a family-owned company, originally out of Bournemouth, I think. And their mission is very much based on a cruelty-free approach to cosmetics. We mentioned the marketing 7 at the top of this, Dan, and for those of us in this, and of course you remember I referenced Oatly, the non-dairy milk brand. So as I'm sure the viewers will realize there's a developing theme here. I am always drawn towards companies that promote anti-animal cruelty and are trying to do things in a different way. I think, with the climate crisis and the way the world is going, we need more companies like this. That's what drew me to Lush. Little side note, and I don't know if I've told you this story in passing or not, but when I was a child, I wanted to become a farmer because I thought, great, you get to look after animals. But then I found out it wasn't about nurturing animals. There was a slightly darker side to it, and I no longer wanted to become a farmer. So yeah, even from a young age, I've been drawn to that kind of aspect of life and business, I guess. So bringing this back to Lush, as I alluded to there, they're passionately and vociferously cruelty-free. All their products are vegetarian or vegan, as far as I know. They're also very good in terms of transparency. They will tell you where the supply chain has come from, where the almonds were grown. Equally, if you've ever shopped there, you've probably seen a little cartoon figure on some of the products. They tell you who's made it, what date they made it, actually where they made it, what factory they were in. They always try to be mindful of the fact that they are a big business now. I see them here in the Netherlands, I see them all around the world. But I think they do their best to make a difference with positive disruption in the world, and really, really push that argument and that fight for sustainability and animal awareness. And I believe they've won multiple awards within the industry for doing that. Another thing that drew me to them is the way they do retail. So not just their ethics and their standards and what they stand for, but the way they're offering both physical and digital retail has always been disruptive for the good. Things like not indulging in Black Friday sales, taking the opportunity to educate consumers. Last year, they actually joined forces with People versus Big Tech in a campaign to fight against intrusive surveillance, predatory algorithms, harmful content and echo chambers. They are doing things very differently to most cosmetics companies, I would say. I believe they're actually the first company not to put products above their fold on their e-com site back in 2017. I mean, tell an e-commerce manager or a homepage manager you can't put products above the fold, you can't put products on the homepage, they're going to pretty much chase you out of the building. But they actually used the digital real estate to inform and educate, and the topic they chose then was drone strikes, and they were campaigning to Theresa May, the then Prime Minister of the UK, to sort of fight against that. So I can't think of any other cosmetics brands or even retail brands in general that do this kind of thing. And just a final little note on why they are a culture crush for me. Not only their sustainability and awareness, but their collaborations. The most recent one was actually a product collaboration with Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, or Hero Turtles if you grew up in the UK. And having grown up in the 90s, it's one of the coolest things I've seen. I think, the turtles are cool again now, so it's fine.
Yeah, for any American listeners, it was deemed back in the 90s that the term ninja would somehow damage the youth of the UK, and the regulator forced them to change it to hero turtles. So there's a little bit of like 90s trivia for you. Yeah, so Lush, you've been called out on Culture Crush. There's obviously a lot there, a lot of stuff that you're doing right, from how you're leading with your digital presence to your supply chain to kind of that transparency. And Bryn and I would love to speak to somebody from your team about why you've made some of those decisions. Because clearly that thing you mentioned about not putting products above the fold is so counter what everybody else would do, but it is obviously working for them as a brand. And I would love to explore with them how they've set up their company culture to make those kind of brave decisions and how they've then backed them in public. I'd love to have a conversation with somebody about that. So Lush people, hit me up. I'd love to have a conversation with you. And Bryn, who knows, maybe I'll get you back on the show and we can have like a three-way conversation together. Now, Bryn, I know that you've been thinking, you've alluded to this already, but you've been thinking about leadership challenges and what people can do about them. So why don't you take those 2 points together and talk us through what kind of cultural challenge you see in the world at the moment that is affecting and impacting leaders, and then talk us through what they can do to address it.
Yeah, the challenge there's multiple challenges that everybody's facing, but the one that really sort of stuck with me was the feeling that we're at a bit of a turning point in terms of consumers. I mean, the research tells you as much, but the next generation of consumers don't really want to be sold to, certainly not by big companies. I think companies are still very keen to pump money into big TV campaigns and ads and celebrity endorsements and all that kind of flashy stuff, I guess you can call it. But, people and the research seem to suggest that that's not what consumers want anymore. I mentioned, generational segmentation earlier, and I'm going to rather contradict myself here, but I'm going to refer to Gen Z and their bio journey. For them, it's all about trust and authenticity. We've done quite a lot of research on this at IKEA and reviewing various sources, and this mindset came over and over. It's very much a case of trust, truth, transparency, and authenticity. One of the numbers I've seen actually was something like 80% of Gen Z would trust companies more if they were using real consumers. They don't want to see celebrities. They don't want to see actors. They want to see real consumers. We live in a world of fake news and subterfuge and false flags, and people are struggling to know what's real and what's not anymore. The next generation of consumer are, much like other previous generations, including myself, are sick of it. I think there needs to be a change in terms of authenticity and reality, getting people messages that come from people like them, or people who are them even, rather than from companies and actors and so on. Granted, there may be risks. I think the advent of deepfake and avatars powered by AI could sort of circumvent some of that if they're good enough. But maybe that's a conversation for another time for you and I.
I think that's a really interesting challenge that you've raised, right? You've got this new generation of consumer that's looking for authentic stories. They want to be part of the story. They don't want to see celebrity endorsements. They don't want to see influencers telling them what they should buy. They're looking for a new level of authenticity and transparency. Now, my take is that that's a real challenge, especially for big businesses and for senior leaders, because it represents a fundamental shift in the way that you conduct your marketing. You can't just buy your way to the top of this game any longer. It's not about like, if we spend enough money, we'll sell enough product. You've got to be telling stories in this new and authentic and challenging way. And if you haven't got the mechanisms in place to hear from your customers, if you don't have the quote unquote soft skills in place within your teams to actually have meaningful conversations, then it's going to be really difficult for you to build the foundations for these new great stories. Perhaps it's a bit easier if you're in a smaller enterprise or a smaller business, because you might be able to to adjust the way you work a little bit faster. But if you are in big business where you have big processes in place already, this is a kind of tectonic shift in the way that you engage your customer and in the way that you create stories. Now, I might be jumping ahead and perhaps like I'm saying some of the things that you're about to tell us, but that's kind of how I read this challenge and why it matters to businesses and to business leaders. Hopefully, I've caught the right vibe there, so do correct me if I've misunderstood anything there. But if that is accurate, what can leaders do about that? Because that's, like I say, a fundamental shift in the way that they tell stories. So how can they respond to that? Because if they don't, they're going to be left behind.
No, you're pretty much on the money, Dan. So in IKEA and Inca Digital, which is our subset of IKEA, we are a content center of expertise. And as such, a lot of our work is, involved around and revolves around having to change stuff like this and suggest different ways of doing things and bring weird and wonderful ideas to the table that may be slightly alien or worrying to people because they aren't the way people have done things. One of the solutions we've been trying to do to help change the way things work and be more focused on what the consumer needs and be more in tune with them as both individuals and civic groups is something called knowledge domain modeling. So this is part of content engineering, wherein we are I'm gonna give a big shout out to my colleagues, Timmy, Karina, and Emil, who do a lot of work on this. But the way I would describe it is knowledge domain models are all about presenting related information in a way that resonates with the consumer. So not just pushing them to follow your site navigation based on a business unit or some other internal business direction. It doesn't really mean much to them as consumers, as people buying your products. They don't need to know whether you class, tables and chairs as kitchen furniture. They just want to buy a table, they want to buy a chair. Or Adidas, they want to buy some sneakers. They don't necessarily need to know if this is a sneaker for running or fashion. They might just like the sneaker and want to buy it. So it's all about finding a way to kind of meet the consumer more in their own headspace. So the approach itself is actually very, very complementary to SEO. The SEO element is key again, because we're going to move away from the traditional SEO keyword approach that Google has bestowed upon us as the mighty overlord of search. And I think until now, we've always followed that keyword approach. But this related knowledge approach and more sort of broader domain knowledge will become more and more important. I think long term, we're already seeing the change. We may not have noticed it yet, or you may not be familiar with it. But if you look at China markets, for example, and the way consumers operate over there, their shopping on social media is actually often away from the actual provider, but it's still all connected, right? So these knowledge domain models are connecting everything up for them and making sure that what they're seeing is not jarring and not irrelevant. It actually kind of flows naturally. Even, for us over in the Western world, if you look at the way the Google results page works, it's pulling in information from different parts of the web, different elements, different types of pieces of information, but it's still all connected. Go a level deeper into Google, and you've got Google Shopping, which again is bringing different shops, particular items to you, rather than you having to go onto a company.com page and start your purchase journey there. And none of this would really be possible without having that sort of knowledge domain models that intersect and connect all these things. Doing things differently is scary, but as we mentioned with Lush back in 2017, they spurned the traditional approach of e-commerce and benefited from it. So yeah, things are changing, and solutions like knowledge domain modeling and being more structured in your content, thinking about content even away from your own website and your own channels is a solution that I can highly recommend.
So we've got this idea of knowledge domain modeling, and I think that example you've given us from Google is such a great way for people to engage with this, because you can see how the search engine is bringing products to you rather than you having to navigate into those different sites. And then you've got content engineering. Now, in layman's terms, I would perhaps frame it as you're creating a way for your brand to remain within the consumer story rather than asking the consumer to get on board with your story, which I think is an interesting way to frame it. And it reminds me of an episode that I've just published recently with Ashley Foss from Atlassian. And one of the things that she talked me through was how oftentimes when your business shows up in the world, the way your business presents its marketing, the way it tells its stories, the way it sells products actually reflects the internal structures of that business. So in the IKEA case, for example, in the past, you may have said, well, we class it as a kitchen table and a kitchen chair, so it belongs in the kitchen section. And that way of presenting products actually represents the internal structures of IKEA. And the challenge that Ashley was talking through is, how do you communicate through the lens of the customer and the story flow and the journey that they need to be on as a consumer? How does the brand align with the way that they engage content, rather than asking the consumer to engage with the brand in the way that they structure their business? So I think this is a really interesting conversation for us to have unpacked. And it's really interesting how that relates to the episode with Ashley a few weeks ago. Now, this will be a new approach to storytelling for a lot of people, and this will be an aha moment for a lot of listeners and a lot of viewers. What's the way that leaders can begin to engage with this? Like, we love to finish each episode with something super practical, a starting point for people to take away and try. But this is quite a big subject. So what's the kind of first step on this journey that you want people to take? How can they engage with this as an action after today's episode?
It is a big thing. It is a new way of doing things, and it is a big change. But if we're honest with ourselves, seismic shifts are needed, and it's how we evolve, and it's how retail will change. It's how experiences will change. It's how consumers are changing. And if companies aren't willing to at least jump on that seismic change, then the consumers will probably move on without them. So the one thing that resonates for me throughout our discussion and in relation to this sort of concept of being where the consumer is rather than being where the company needs to be, and you put it much more eloquently than I did, Dan, is that it's okay to be different. It's okay to do things differently and break tradition. Be a rule breaker, be divergent, be disruptive. If anything, current and future consumers will be much more likely to interact with us as brands and therefore purchase from you if you are doing something slightly different that will attract their attention. They'll be excited by the change, and they'll feel like you are moving with them and for them.
Well, Bryn, I think that takes us full circle right back to the beginning of this episode. We were talking about context and how sometimes it's difficult when you're in the moment to be aware of the wider context, to be aware of the big shifts that are happening around you. And I think this challenge that you've brought to us is a challenge to businesses that says, hey, your consumer is changing. It might not feel like it on a Monday or a Tuesday, but when you take a 6-month view or when you take a year view, things are changing fast and they are changing drastically. And it may actually be that if you change the way you're telling stories, if you adapt your story to flow with the consumer rather than asking the consumer to flow with you, that may lead to some short-term disruption because you're going to be changing the way you do business. But in reality, if you don't make those changes, the world is going to move on without you. And if you start to make those changes, start being brave, start entering that disruptive mindset, there are long-term commercial benefits, long-term wins. There's an opportunity to build a community around some of your products and some of your enterprises. But you've got to be brave and roll with that change rather than thinking, well, I can't feel it right now. In the context of today, it doesn't feel like much is changing. It is. It's happening around you. So you've got to get with that change and change with it and influence it in your favor. Bryn, it's been such a fascinating conversation. And thank you for our second ever recording together. It's been so great to have you on Culture Crush. Thank you for making some time for the show. And let's speak again soon.
Thanks for having me, Dan. Really appreciate it.
And that's a wrap for today's episode of Culture Crush. If you've enjoyed your time with us, please like and subscribe wherever you're listening from. And if you're a Culture First leader, be sure to visit anthem.oo because we've got lots in common. See you next time.